The night should have been filled with joy. A healthy baby had been born, her tiny cries echoing against the wooden walls of the cabin. The mother, pale but glowing, cradled the newborn girl in her trembling arms. She whispered soft words, already imagining a future filled with lullabies, first steps, and laughter echoing across the plains. To her, the baby was perfect. 10 small fingers, 10 small toes, a warm weight against her heart. But the father, standing in the corner, did not see what she saw. His face was hard, his jaw clenched tight. All his hopes had been tied to this moment, but instead of pride, disappointment clouded his features. He had dreamed of a son, a boy to carry his name, to ride at his side, to one day inherit his land and cattle. To him, a daughter was weakness, a burden that offered no legacy. "You promised me a boy," he muttered, his voice cold and flat. The mother's heart broke at the words. How could he say that? This child was a gift from God, a miracle. She tried to remind him of the struggle, of the long nights she had carried the child in her womb, of the prayers they had both whispered. She begged him to look closer, to see the curve of the baby's lips, the softness of her cheeks, the spark of life in her eyes. But he would not. Instead, he turned away. His boots thudded against the floor as he paced, muttering curses under his breath. What good is a girl? She can't carry my name. She can't stand beside me. His bitterness grew with each word, until the cabin seemed smaller, suffocating under the weight of his anger. The mother wept quietly, clutching the baby tighter. She had thought his love was strong enough to weather anything, but she had been wrong. Pride was stronger. Pride, and the poisonous belief that only a son was worthy of love. By dawn, his decision was made. Without so much as a gentle touch to the child, he gathered his things. The sound of the door slamming shut echoed like a final blow, leaving behind silence broken only by the baby's soft cries. She called after him, her voice hoarse with grief. "Please, don't leave us!" But he did not turn back. Alone, she rocked her daughter in her arms, her tears soaking the baby's blanket. Fear pressed in around her, fear of survival, fear of gossip, fear of the future. Yet even in her sorrow, she whispered a vow. "If no one else will love you, my child, I will. If no one else will stay, I will never leave you." Thus began her journey, not just as a mother, but as a woman abandoned for something beyond her control. The cruel departure of the man who should have cherished them would mark the start of her struggle. But in that struggle, seeds of resilience were planted. What she could not know in that moment was that the emptiness left by his absence would one day be filled by another, a man of few words, but of steady heart. A man who would see her daughter not as a disappointment, but as a gift worth protecting with his life. The days following her husband's abandonment blurred together like a heavy fog. The cabin that once echoed with 2 voices now felt unbearably empty. Every creak of the floorboards reminded her of the boots that no longer walked there. Every chair seemed to hold a ghost of the man who had turned his back on her and their child. Yet, despite the grief pressing down on her chest, she had no choice but to keep moving, for her baby's sake. The first morning alone was the hardest. She woke to the sound of her daughter's soft cries, a reminder that hunger never waited, not even for sorrow. With trembling hands, she wrapped the infant close to her chest and stepped outside. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of dust and sage, and the prairie stretched out endlessly before her. It felt both freeing and suffocating at once. A wide world to survive in, but one she must now face without a partner. Money was scarce. What little savings they had, her husband had taken with him, leaving only a few coins in a jar on the shelf. She counted them again and again, each time feeling the pit in her stomach grow. They wouldn't last a week, much less a season. The pantry was half empty, the flour sack light as air. Every meal would need to be stretched, and every scrap saved. She found herself doing things she had never done before, chopping wood with aching arms, hauling water from the well with a baby tied to her back, patching fences and mending clothes long past their prime. Her hands, once soft, grew rough and blistered. Nights were the worst. When the baby finally slept, Silence pressed in from every corner, whispering her failures and fears. She often wept quietly into her pillow, but in the morning she rose again, because the tiny girl in her arms needed her to. The townsfolk soon began to notice. Some offered sympathy, a kind word here or there, but most only gave pitying glances or whispered behind her back. A woman abandoned was a scandal in itself, but a woman abandoned with a newborn daughter, why, that was a story ripe for gossip. They said she must have done something to drive her husband away, or perhaps she wasn't strong enough to keep him. They rarely spoke of his cruelty. Instead, they looked at her as if she carried shame like a second skin. Still, she pressed forward. She took in laundry from neighbors, sewed when she could, and even worked in the fields during harvest, the baby wrapped snugly against her chest. Every coin she earned went to keep her child fed. It was exhausting, but in every quiet smile from her baby, in every soft coo, she found a reason to endure. She learned resilience in those long weeks. She learned that she could carry more than she ever thought possible, that her arms could hold a baby while her hands worked, that her back could bend under weight but not break. She discovered a strength that had been buried deep, a strength born from necessity and fueled by love. But strength did not erase loneliness. Each night, as the baby's tiny breath rose and fell beside her, she longed for a steady presence, a pair of arms to help share the burden. And though she didn't know it yet, someone had been watching from afar, a man whose silence was not indifference, but careful observation. Her struggle was not hidden. Out on the prairie, even the strongest walls could not keep out the eyes of neighbors. And in the stillness of his own ranch, the silent man was beginning to notice not just her pain, but her courage. Life in a small prairie town was never private. Every action, every choice, every stumble was magnified under the eyes of neighbors who thrived on stories to fill the quiet evenings. When her husband left, it wasn't just her heart that bore the wound. It was her reputation, too. Within days, the tale spread like wildfire across fence posts, church pews, and trading counters. "Did you hear?" one woman murmured at the general store, her hands busy scooping flour, but her eyes glittering with curiosity. "He walked out because the baby wasn't a boy," another replied, her tone a mix of pity and disdain. Imagine that. A man so proud of his name he'd throw away his own family. But soon the words twisted, as gossip always does. Some said she must have quarreled with him until he had no choice but to leave. Others claimed she wasn't fit to be a wife and mother. And though there were a few who whispered about his cruelty, those voices were drowned out by the louder tide of judgment. Everywhere she went, she felt the stares. At church, women whispered behind handkerchiefs, their eyes darting toward the baby in her arms. At the market, men tipped their hats politely, but their glances carried unspoken questions. She held her head high, but inside the weight of their eyes burned. Each word carried on the wind seemed sharper than the last, cutting into her already fragile spirit. Yet, as gossip swirled, there was one man who never joined in. He rarely spoke at all, but his silence carried a different kind of weight. The silent rancher, known to most as a man of few words and steady hands, heard the rumors like everyone else. He heard of the husband's cruel departure, of the mother's struggle, of the child who was considered less because she was a girl. But instead of judgment, something else stirred in him, anger at the injustice, and something softer, a kind of admiration. This was not the first time he had seen her. He remembered her from before, walking through town with her head held high, her husband beside her, hope shining in her eyes. Now he saw her differently, her shoulders bent under invisible burdens, her arms clutching the child as though to shield her from the world. But her spirit had not broken. She worked, she endured, she kept moving. That strength spoke louder to him than any gossip ever could. The whispers of the town only seemed to make her more isolated. Some women who might have offered kindness chose distance instead, afraid of being caught in the scandal. A few men eyed her with a different kind of interest, opportunistic, not honorable. And so she stood alone, her only true companion, the tiny girl whose presence was both her burden and her blessing. the prairie had a way of amplifying loneliness. Wide-open skies stretched endlessly above, the wind carried every rumor farther than it should, and the nights, though beautiful, were cruelly quiet. But what she did not know was that in the stillness of another ranch house, the silent rancher was beginning to notice. Not just her hardship, but her resilience. Not just the way the town whispered about her, but the way she faced it with a dignity they could not strip from her. He did not speak of it to anyone. He did not defend her in public or challenge the talk, though perhaps he wanted to. Instead, he kept watch from the shadows of his quiet life, his silence not of indifference, but of patience. Something within him was shifting, a slow awareness that her story and his might one day intertwine. And so the prairie whispered on, sometimes with cruelty, sometimes with pity, but beneath the noise, something else was taking root. A connection waiting to grow, unseen, like wild grass pushing up through dry earth after a storm. The silent rancher was a man known more by his presence than by his words. Folks in town often described him in short sentences, as if they couldn't say much more. Keeps to himself, hard worker, doesn't waste breath. To many, he was an enigma. A man who rode into town for supplies, nodded politely, and left again without more than a handful of spoken words. But those who lived long enough on the prairie knew that silence was not always emptiness. Sometimes it was the language of those who carried burdens too heavy to explain. His life had not been without loss. Years before, he had loved once briefly and fiercely. A young woman with laughing eyes had filled his home with light. But fate had stolen her away, an illness that swept through without warning, leaving him with empty rooms and the sound of his own voice echoing back at him. After that, he had grown quieter. Speaking seemed pointless when there was no one left to hear. Words could not bring her back, nor could they ease the ache in his chest. So he stopped wasting them. Instead, he poured himself into the land. His ranch became his companion, the cattle his responsibility, the horses his partners, the wide sky his silent confidant. Every sunrise and sunset reminded him of both what he had lost and what he had left to tend. Over time, the townsfolk stopped asking about his past. They simply accepted him as he was, the silent man with steady hands and eyes that seemed to carry more than they revealed. It was into this silence that whispers of her struggle reached him. At first, he dismissed them the way he dismissed most town talk, empty chatter to fill the spaces between chores. But the more he heard, the more his heart stirred. The picture they painted of her, abandoned, struggling, judged, made something restless inside him. He knew what it was to lose, to feel abandoned by life itself. He knew what it was to sit in an empty room, wishing for a voice, a presence, a hand to hold. The sight of her in town only deepened this stirring. He noticed the way she carried her baby close, as if daring anyone to suggest her child was not enough. He noticed how her shoulders, though heavy with burden, never slumped in defeat. Her eyes no longer held the sparkle they once had, but beneath the weariness there was a quiet determination that reminded him of his own battles. She was fighting to survive, not for herself alone, but for her child. That strength touched him more deeply than he cared to admit. Still, he said nothing. What could he say? Words had never been his gift. And besides, what place did he have in her story? He was just a man alone, watching from a distance. Yet even in his silence, he began to act in small, unnoticed ways. Once he dropped off extra firewood near her cabin, leaving before she could see him. Another time, he left a sack of flour on her porch, pretending it must have been a store mix-up if she ever asked. These were gestures he could manage, actions, not words. At night, as he sat by the dim light of his lantern, he wrestled with thoughts he could not voice. He did not think of her as a scandal or a burden, the way the town did. He thought of her as a woman who deserved better than the cruelty she had been given. And her child, the little girl dismissed by her own father, stirred something protective in him. The burden he carried, of loss, of silence, of loneliness, began to shift. For years he had borne it alone, certain no one could lighten it. But now, as he thought of her, of the baby, of the life they were carving out against all odds, he felt a different weight. The pull of responsibility, of care, of a desire to step forward. He had not yet spoken it aloud, but somewhere deep within, the silent rancher began to wonder if his burden was no longer meant to be carried alone. The prairie was a land of extremes, scorching heat in the summer, bone-deep cold in the winter, and storms that rolled across the horizon without mercy. On one such evening, the sky had darkened far too quickly, the wind turning sharp, carrying the metallic scent of rain. The young mother had ventured farther from town than usual, hoping to trade a few mended garments for supplies, her baby bundled against her chest. She had misjudged the clouds. By the time she realized the storm's speed, the path home was already soaked, the dirt road slick beneath her worn boots. She pressed forward, holding her child close, whispering reassurances the baby couldn't understand, but somehow seemed to calm at the sound of. The rain came in sheets, stinging her face, soaking her dress until it clung heavily to her frame. Her hair plastered to her cheeks, her body shivered, and every step grew heavier. She was determined to make it back before nightfall, but the storm grew fiercer, the wind howling like a beast across the open land. Her wagon, already fragile from age and neglect, finally gave way. One wheel cracked against a rock and snapped, splintering under the weight. The jolt nearly threw her off balance, and she stumbled, clutching her baby as the wagon tilted uselessly to the side. Her heart sank. Stranded, far from home, with rain drenching both her and the child, she felt panic claw at her chest, and then, through the storm's roar, came the sound of hooves. At first she feared it might be strangers, rough men who wouldn't think twice about taking advantage of a woman alone. But as the rider drew closer, the silhouette became familiar. Broad shoulders hunched against the rain, reins held with steady control, and a horse that seemed as calm as if the storm were nothing more than a drizzle. It was him, the silent rancher. He reined in beside her without hesitation. His sharp eyes took in the broken wagon, her soaked figure, the baby's small face peeking from the blanket. For a moment neither spoke. Rain poured between them, and the world seemed to narrow to this single meeting on a desolate road. Then, without a word, he dismounted. His boots sank into the mud, and with quiet efficiency, he reached for the baby first. She hesitated, clutching her daughter protectively, but the look in his eyes, steady, unyielding, kind, made her loosen her hold. He took the child into his arms with surprising gentleness, shielding her with his coat. Next, he turned to her. He offered his hand, strong and calloused, and helped her onto his horse. He mounted behind her, the baby safely in his arms, and with a subtle nudge of his heels, the horse surged forward through the storm. She didn't know where he was taking them. Home? Town? Somewhere else? But in that moment, the fear that had gripped her eased. For the first time since her husband's departure, she felt the weight of her struggle lift, even if only for a short ride. The rancher said nothing as the horse carried them across the rain-soaked prairie. He didn't need to. His silence wasn't cold. It was steady, a shelter stronger than the broken wagon she had been left with. By the time the outline of his ranch house emerged through the sheets of rain, she understood what words could not have conveyed. He wasn't about to leave her out in the storm. That night would mark the turning point. What began as a chance encounter born of circumstance was, in truth, the first step toward something greater, a bond forged not in words, but in actions. For her, it was the first glimmer of hope that she and her child might not be as alone as she believed. For him, it was the beginning of a new chapter, one where his silence would no longer be the mark of isolation, but the foundation of a quiet, steadfast love. The storm had spent itself by the time they reached his ranch. Rain still dripped from the eaves, and the air was heavy with the scent of wet earth. But the thunder had rolled off toward the distant hills. He guided her inside without a word, his steady hand supporting her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The cabin was simple, sturdy and unmistakably a man's dwelling, sparse furniture, tools neatly arranged, boots by the door. Yet there was warmth in the flickering fire he quickly stoked back to life, in the way he laid a blanket across her shoulders, in the pot of coffee he wordlessly set to brew. His silence might have unnerved another, but she found it strangely comforting. After months of whispers and cruel words, his quiet was not judgmental. It was steady, expectant, safe. She settled her baby near the fire, drying her tiny clothes on a chair. The child gurgled softly, untroubled by the storm now past. Watching her daughter smile at the play of flames, she felt a moment of peace she hadn't known since the night of the birth. For the first time in months, she wasn't fighting alone. The rancher moved through the cabin with efficiency, saying little but doing much. He brought out dry clothes, too large for her but warm, and stepped outside briefly to tend to the horse, returning soaked himself but unconcerned. When she tried to thank him, her words tumbled awkwardly into the quiet space between them. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that said more than his tongue could manage. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the house began to shift. She intended to leave once the storm had passed, but when he insisted, through a gesture more than speech, that she and the child stay until she was strong again, she found herself agreeing. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in her bones, or perhaps it was the rare sense of security she felt under his roof. Life on his ranch was quiet, but not empty. He rose early, as ranchers do, and she woke soon after, tending to her baby before helping where she could. Though he never asked for her labor, she found small ways to give back, mending a shirt, cooking a meal, tidying the corners of the cabin. These were things she had done for her husband before, but here they felt different, less like obligation and more like gratitude. The silence between them grew comfortable. She learned to read the meaning in his gestures, the way he set an extra plate without asking, the way he lingered by the crib to rock the baby when she fussed, the way he left tools within reach if she wished to help. He, in turn, seemed to notice her unspoken needs. When she struggled to carry a bucket, he appeared at her side. When loneliness flickered in her eyes, he lingered in the doorway a little longer. The baby, innocent and open-hearted, became the bridge between them. Her laughter filled the cabin, softening its edges. One evening, when the child grasped the rancher's finger and refused to let go, she caught the rare curve of a smile on his lips. It was small, fleeting, but it lit the room more brightly than any lamp. For a woman who had been abandoned, the silent rancher's wordless kindness was a balm. Here was a man who did not see her daughter as a disappointment, who did not measure her worth by what she could give him. He gave without demand, protected without condition, and though he had hardly spoken a dozen words, she began to feel something stir, a trust she thought she'd never offer again. Theirs was a home without words, yet it spoke volumes. Each act of care, each quiet gesture, built a foundation stronger than promises shouted in anger or vows broken in pride. And though neither of them could see it clearly yet, the silence was slowly weaving them into something like family. By the time the young mother was strong enough to return to town, weeks had passed since the storm. Her daughter was thriving, cheeks rosy with health, and she herself no longer looked so gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. Life under the silent rancher's roof had given her rest, food, and a sense of security she hadn't known since before her husband's cruel departure. But stepping back into town meant facing something harder than weather or work, the eyes and tongues of people who lived for gossip. When she walked into the general store with her baby cradled against her chest, conversation slowed. A few women nodded politely, but most watched her with thin smiles and knowing glances. They had seen her absence, noticed her return, and were already stitching together a story that suited their liking. Staying out at his place, "I hear," one woman whispered behind a shelf of canned peaches. "Without a ring? Bold, isn't it?" another muttered. "Or desperate," the first replied, her voice dripping with false pity. Their voices weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. She heard every word. Her cheeks burned, yet she kept her chin high, refusing to let them see the sting. She knew what they thought, that she had traded one man for another, that she was a woman of questionable morals. None of them cared to understand the truth, that she had been rescued from a storm, sheltered with kindness, and treated with more respect in silence than she ever had with words of promises from her husband. The men were no less judgmental. Some tipped their hats but smirked as they did, as though they knew a joke she wasn't privy to. A few looked at her with interest that made her skin crawl, their eyes calculating in a way that made her hold her baby tighter. The silent rancher's name was on more than one tongue that day, often spoken with a tone of curiosity mixed with skepticism. What puzzled the town most was him. The rancher was not the kind of man to involve himself with others, much less with a woman carrying another man's child. His silence made him difficult to read, and the mystery only fueled the gossip. Some whispered that he pitied her. Others claimed he must have plans for her land, her labor, or worse. People who didn't understand often filled the gaps with suspicion. But the truth was simpler and far deeper. He had seen her struggle, and he had chosen to act. He did not speak of it, nor did he defend himself when rumors reached his ears. He went about his business as always, riding into town for supplies, nodding to the shopkeeper, ignoring the murmurs at his back. His calm refusal to feed the gossip only made him seem more enigmatic. For her, the judgment cut more deeply. Already wounded by abandonment, she found herself carrying the weight of shame she did not deserve. Yet each time she returned to the ranch, she was reminded of a different truth. There, in the quiet rhythm of daily life, she was not scorned or belittled. Her child was not a disappointment. The rancher never demanded, never judged, never asked her to explain. His silence, once puzzling, had become her refuge. Still, the sting of the town's whispers lingered. She wondered if they would ever see her as more than a scandal, if they would ever believe that what was growing between her and the rancher was not sin or desperation, but something steadier, something forged in storm and silence. The judgment of the town became another storm she had to weather, one without rain or thunder but no less fierce. Yet she was learning, slowly, that storms could pass, and that sometimes, standing beside her in the quiet afterward, there would be someone who didn't care what the world thought, only what was right. The prairie night had a way of stripping things bare. With no walls of noise, no distractions but the stars, truth often surfaced in the quiet. It was on such an evening, long after the child had drifted to sleep, that the silent rancher finally found the words he had carried for weeks. The day had been like any other. Chores on the ranch, meals shared at the table, the steady rhythm of life that was becoming strangely natural to them both. She had mended his shirt by lamplight, the baby playing at her feet, and he had repaired a loose shutter on the porch. These small exchanges had built a foundation stronger than either realized, a pattern of giving and receiving that required no grand declarations. But beneath that simplicity lay something deeper, something that needed to be spoken. He had noticed her unease in town. He had seen how the whispers cut into her spirit, even though she tried to hide it behind steady eyes. He knew the gossip weighed on her more than she admitted. And though he had never been one to care about what others thought, he cared about what it did to her. That evening, as the fire crackled low, she sat with the baby asleep in her lap, humming softly. He stood by the door for a long time, as if debating with himself. Finally, he crossed the room, pulled out a chair, and sat across from her. His hands rested on the table, large and calloused, twitching slightly as though they were not used to such restlessness. She looked up at him, puzzled by his stillness. His eyes, usually calm, carried an intensity that made her catch her breath. For a long moment, it seemed as though he might not speak at all, but then, in a voice low and rough from disuse, he finally said the words that would change everything. "She can have my name." The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. At first she didn't understand. Her lips parted, but no words came. He had said so little since the day they met, and now, in one brief sentence, he had offered her more than anyone ever had. He cleared his throat, his eyes dropping briefly to the child before returning to hers. "You too, if you'll take it," her heart lurched. The meaning of his words washed over her slowly. He wasn't just offering shelter or pity or protection from gossip. He was offering belonging, a family, a name for her daughter, a name that would shield them both from the cruelty of whispers. And more than that, a place in his life that was steady, sure, and real. Tears stung her eyes before she could stop them. She had never expected such a gift. After being discarded for bringing life into the world after enduring hunger, shame, and loneliness, this simple sentence broke something open inside her. She saw not just a man of silence, but a man of substance. A man who valued her daughter, not as a disappointment, but as a child worthy of love. She began, her voice trembling. Are you sure? He gave a single, deliberate nod. Names mean protection, belonging. She deserves that. So do you. There was no poetry in his words, no elaborate promises, but she realized, with sudden clarity, that she trusted them more than all the pretty speeches her husband had ever given. Words were easy to spill in anger or pride. His hard-won and spoken with weight were precious. She reached across the table, her hand resting lightly over his. It was rough, warm, steady. Her tears slipped down her cheeks, but her smile was radiant. Then we will take it, she whispered. And in that quiet cabin under the endless prairie sky, a new family was formed. Not by blood or by pride, but by choice. By love spoken not in many words, but in the right ones. The days that followed his offer were unlike any she had lived before. For so long her life had been shaped by rejection, first by the man who abandoned her, then by the town that whispered about her behind closed doors. Yet now, every morning, she woke with a sense of belonging she had thought forever out of reach. His words, few though they were, had planted a seed of hope deep within her heart. Still she wrestled with doubts. At night, as her baby slept soundly in the cradle he had built with his own hands, she would sit awake by the fire and wonder, why me? Why us? Was it pity that moved him or something more? Did he feel bound by a sense of duty, or did he truly see them as part of his life? The scars left by her husband's cruelty made it difficult to accept kindness without suspicion. But every day, the silent rancher answered her doubts, not with explanations, but with actions. When her baby fussed at dawn, it was often his arms that rocked the child back to sleep. When she struggled with a chore, he appeared quietly at her side, steadying her hands. When the townsfolk's gossip grew sharper, he stood beside her at the store, his very presence a shield stronger than any words could have been. It became clear that his offer had not been born of pride or obligation. Pride was what had destroyed her husband, a man so consumed with wanting a son to carry his name that he had cast aside the treasure he already had. Pride had whispered that only a boy was worthy, that only a wife who delivered him such could stand beside him. Pride had poisoned love until it crumbled into abandonment. The rancher was different. His life had stripped away pride long ago, leaving only quiet strength. He did not measure worth in sons or daughters, in gossip or reputation. To him, the child's laughter was enough. Her presence filled the silence of his home with something he hadn't realized he needed: innocence, warmth, a future. And the mother, weary but unbroken, carried herself with a resilience that moved him more than words could say. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the prairie in shades of gold, she stood watching him mend a fence. The baby giggled nearby, reaching for wildflowers. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future not shadowed by abandonment, but built on quiet devotion. She realized then that his love was not like the passion-filled promises her husband had once spoken, but something far sturdier. It was in the way he worked without complaint, the way he gave without asking, the way he saw her child as a blessing rather than a burden. That evening, as they sat together in the quiet, she turned to him with tears in her eyes, not tears of sorrow but of gratitude. "You've given us more than a name," she whispered. "You've given us a life." He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady, then gave the faintest nod. That was his way. Few words, but a depth of meaning in every one. And in that moment, she understood that love need not be loud to be true. Pride had once driven away the man she thought would stand beside her forever. But now love, steady, silent, enduring, was drawing her towards someone who had chosen her not for what she could give him, but simply for who she was and for the child she carried. She chose love over pride, and in doing so, she discovered that sometimes the quietest promises were the ones most faithfully kept. The prairie had a way of shaping lives as surely as the winds shaped the tall grasses. Seasons shifted, storms came and went, but what endured was what was rooted deep and strong. In time, that was what their little family became, rooted, steady, unshaken. Life on the ranch was not easy. There were fences to mend, cattle to drive, harvests to bring in before the frost, and nights when coyotes howled so close they seemed to scratch at the windows. Yet amid the challenges, there was a peace that neither the woman nor her child had ever known before. She found purpose in her days, joy in the rhythm of hard work shared, and safety in the presence of the man who had once spoken so few words, but had changed her life with the ones he had chosen. The townsfolk, at first suspicious and full of gossip, slowly quieted. It was difficult to whisper against a man who carried himself with such quiet dignity. His silence had always made him a mystery, but now, as he walked beside her in the streets, carrying her child in his arms as though she were his own blood, people saw a truth they could not deny. This was a family. Whatever had come before no longer mattered. The little girl thrived in that love. She grew strong, chasing chickens in the yard, laughing at the rancher's horse, curling up against him in the evenings. Where once there had been only silence, now there was laughter filling the walls of his home. And though he never became a man of many words, he learned to speak in ways that mattered most, an encouraging murmur when the child tried something new, a gentle word to the woman when the weight of memory threatened her peace. Then one day, the child spoke her first clear word. They had been outside, the rancher sharpening tools while the woman washed clothes. The girl toddled unsteadily across the grass, her tiny arms outstretched. When she reached him, she tugged at his pant leg and with a bright, triumphant smile said, "Papa." The word hung in the air like music. The woman froze, her eyes widening with tears, while the rancher's hands stilled on the whetstone. He looked down at the child, his expression unreadable at first. Slowly, something softened in his eyes. He bent, scooped her up in his strong arms, and for the briefest moment, she swore she saw a smile cross his face, small, fleeting, but real. The child repeated it, clapping her little hands. "Papa! Papa!" The woman pressed a hand to her mouth, overcome. That word was more than a child's first attempt at speech. It was a declaration, a seal on the promise he had made with so few words before. The child, unburdened by the pride and cruelty of men who measured worth in sons, had claimed him as her father, and he, silent but unshakable, accepted it with a tenderness that needed no language. In that moment, the woman realized that love had finally given her everything she had longed for, not just a partner, but a true father for her child. A man whose love was steady and sure, not conditional or selfish. Pride had abandoned her, but silence had stayed. And within that silence, she had found the loudest, clearest proof of devotion. The prairie night settled around them as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the land in hues of rose and gold. The rancher held the child close, the woman standing beside him, their silhouettes etched against the fading light. They were not bound by grand speeches or the expectations of others, but by something far more enduring, love forged in the quiet, in the simple choice to stay, to protect, to belong, and so, a family was made, not through blood or pride, but through silence, sacrifice, and love that spoke louder than words ever could.